real reversion to oh goodness, it's very active, your computer this morning, isn't it? I'm trying to keep up with it. Okay. Right, got it. Right, got you. Okay, hopefully it will calm down now. Right. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so in another piece of work that I've been doing recently, which is a critique of the Sewell report, which came out a couple of years ago, I talked about this idea of racial formation and the idea that there have been competing racial projects, if you like, within the state that have really framed policy in relation to Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, people of colour, but also refugee populations. And I contrast between a conservative nationalist approach, which I think we see very much in the ascendancy now, and of course the organic crisis of global capitalism. We've seen a reversion to ethno-nationalisms around the world. And in the UK context, that's been exemplified by Brexit, of course, and also by the whole idea of the hostile environment, introduced under Theresa May, but then carried on and amplified by Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, and others. But the nationalist, conservative nationalist project in education has been very much front and center, that the culture wars as well in education, and the critique of decolonizing the curriculum and all of the other things we've come to know. And in the context of the Sewell report, it's really underlined a colorblind approach to education. So if one read the Sewell report, one would be forgiven for thinking that racism is no longer a problem in education, when we know it is a deeply structural problem. And I think what this model also helps us to do is to identify the kinds of what we mean by institutionalized racism. So I think you can use this model to show both, on the one hand, what's structurally racist about our education system, but also on the other hand, the possibilities and potential for transformation and how one might think about transforming it. So here I take a slightly different view from some from some anti-racists who don't really think about the possibilities for change. I come from a Gramscian background. That's my own intellectual background. And so I would see the education system as a fundamentally contested terrain, and all of the institutions of the state as being ultimately contested. And I think, it's a struggle, it's a war in the trenches. And then, so I see it differently from those who think that unless the whole edifice of racial capitalism collapses, you can't see any change. I think it's really important, actually, that all of us continue to struggle within the state and civil society for change. And having grown up in the 80s and getting involved in anti-racist struggles there and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, we know how important that is, that kind of struggle. So I hope that this diagram can also kind of help to illustrate, this model can help to illustrate that terrain of struggle as well, what it is that we need to be battling around when it comes to the education of our refugee and asylum-seeking young people. So then, of course, there's the wider policy environment as well within that broader historical milieu. And the Borders and Nationalities Act was introduced last year, and it really is a draconian piece of legislation. And what it does, as far as refugees are concerned, is that it creates two tiers. So they're trying to differentiate between those that come through so-called safe routes from their country of origin, from those that go on journeys through other countries and come on less official routes into the country, including, of course, small boats. But of course, this has huge implications for education, because it means that whereas people who come from Route 1, so people who are resettled from Afghanistan, for example, or from Ukraine, you know, they get 5 years right to remain in the country, and it's much easier for them to access the education system. Those who are tier 2 are going to really struggle because they have to constantly reapply for their right to remain, and it's much harder for them to actually access to get into school to begin with. So it's creating a 2-tier system, the new legislation. And the new legislation is also hugely discriminatory because they've introduced this new process of age assessment. So there has been an issue in the past, as we know, of refugees either not knowing or misrepresenting their age, or being misrepresented by the authorities. So they've centralized the process. So before it used to be handled at local authority level, but now it's centralized, and it's likely to be much more draconian and difficult for refugees to get through that process, to have their age affirmed. The other part of the wider policy environment that's really important to mention in this context is the increasing fragmentation of our education system in England, which is really very much part of the picture. So whereas before, when I started doing this research back in the 80s, you know, there was local authorities like Birmingham, like many of the London authorities, like Bristol, you know, had very well developed ethnic minority achievement services. They had centralized EAL support that could work with schools and be very supportive of schools in terms of developing their capabilities. But of course, that's all been run down now. So it's very difficult to find that level of support. They used to also track and monitor the progress and attainment, the experiences of different groups of minoritized and racialized learners at local authority level. It's very difficult to get that data now. In fact, there's no data at all. The government doesn't publish data about the achievement, the exclusions, the rate of absenteeism of refugee learners. You have to get the data that I showed you before, involved a lot of very complex, had to work with several databases. I'm looking at Ricardo, the National Pupil Database, but also the databases relating to refugee populations, and can't try and put them together. It's not actually published. So in terms of a broader enabling environment, I mean, combating this new legislation is really important. Tackling the broader hostile environment, which is something that you came across, Jáfia, in your research, you know, is very much part of the struggle. But also demanding that the government actually, you know, takes cognizance of this issue and collects the data that's necessary for understanding what people are facing. So in terms of the system then, you know, that funding within this Wild West landscape that we have now is very much hit and miss. It really is a postcode lottery. If you're a refugee, which local authority, if you're in a local authority, if you're in an academy trust, whether the academy, how much of the resource the academy trust decides to devote to language, for example, and other kinds of needs of refugees. So the government could do a lot more to ring fence funding and provision for refugee learners. And of course, we have a national curriculum. And, you know, one of the things that I think Jáfia might talk about is the importance of recognizing, you know, refugees' funds of knowledge, what they bring, and recognizing, you know, so there are a lot of issues to do with the curriculum, with decolonizing the curriculum, with diversifying the curriculum that really speak to the experiences of refugee learners in particular, to make it relevant for them. And of course, it's important for our own learners as well to understand why refugees are here in the first place. One of the key issues that many refugees face is a really hostile environment in schools. And unless it's part of the curriculum, and unless there's an inclusive pedagogy that goes with it, then you know, it becomes very difficult in schools to break that culture. But the government can do a lot about that in terms of the frameworks that it sets around the curriculum in particular, but also the support it gives for teacher education. At Bristol, where I'm based, our PGCE students do literally one afternoon in the whole year. That's around not just refugees, but all Black minority issues of race and ethnicity and language in education. One afternoon in a year, and I'm the person that gives that. So, you know, it should, of course, be integrated throughout teacher education provision, and it's not. It's similar with lots of issues to do with inclusive education as well, more broadly, Nidhi. It's just not there, is it? So, you know, again, you know, in terms of the system, that's something that the government really should be focusing on. And I hope if the next government does that. But of course, we know that, you know, our refugee learners turning to the next environment, you know, the enabling home and community environment, live in poverty. They live in dire poverty. They in many instances, the only entitlement that refugee families have is something like £5 a day to pay for everything. So you find our refugee learners in our most disadvantaged parts of our cities. In Bristol, it's in our inner cities, in the tower blocks, in overcrowded situations. But now, of course, under the new Nationality and Borders Act, they're going to be kept on barges and even more oppressive and difficult living conditions. And we know, of course, that 40% or more of children's learning, you know, or progress is accounted for by what happens outside of school in the home, you know. So if there isn't a safe place to work in the home, a good environment, then, you know, it's very difficult. And of course, you know, that's something that you found very much to be the case. And it was amplified through the pandemic, of course, you know, where it was our refugees, our poorest children, that had least access to computers and other kinds of support. So multi-agency approaches are really important for tackling poverty. Of course, this used to happen at a local authority level too, where you could have more of a joined up interagency approach for dealing with these kinds of issues. And, you know, being able to talk with newly arrived, with parents. And of course, many parents, when they come over, have very different experiences of education systems, whether it's in Somalia or in other countries, and are often really confused about what's going on in schools here. You know, so there's a real need to kind of work with parents. And of course, you know, parents, particularly mothers, because of the patriarchal society that we live in, often play more of a role in terms of supporting their children's learning than do fathers. But again, because of the patriarchal nature of society that we live in, they're often denied their own access to language support. So we have there's fantastic people in Bristol that are working on the whole ESOL area, but it's so important providing language support for parents of refugees. So, and it's important not only for the women themselves, but because then they can support their own children's education better. And of course, you know, having things like translation services, being able to really assess children's learning when they arrive at the school is really important, and understand about their experiences. So those early encounters are particularly important for newly arrived learners. Okay, I'll stop in a moment because I know that I've probably talked for far too long. One more minute. Okay, so just to say that with the school environment, you know, what works here, of course, is a whole institutional approach. And of course, we know this from basic school improvement research. It's been gone on for many years. We know this from the work on inclusion in schools, from Melainsko on, you know, people, you've written about it as well, Nidhi. You know, the idea of a whole institutional approach where the leadership, school leadership, takes absolute priority, where there's a whole school approach through the curriculum, through engaging with parents, through opportunities for professional development, through the culture and ethos that the school is providing to provide the kind of support that refugee learners need. providing a welcoming environment, meeting specific psychosocial needs that they inevitably have, and being able to drill down to the individual needs of learners. And one of the things that we've often come across from educators is a resistance, or we sometimes, which is part of, it's itself related to institutionalized racism and a colorblind approach, that people will turn around and say, well, yes, well, what about our other kids that are disadvantaged? Why are we focusing on our Black refugee kids when there's all these other... And the answer to that, of course, is that when you do have a whole school approach that's able to drill down and deal with the intersecting needs of individual learners, that kind of intelligence benefits all the learners in the school. So schools that have adopted, become safe havens, have seen, for refugees, have also seen an improvement in their scores for all learners. So I'll stop there because I'm out of time, but I hope that gives a flavour of the model, and thanks for the opportunity to present my ideas.
Jáfia, and I forgot to ask you, you're okay for this to be recorded? You're okay for it to be recorded? Yes. Jáfia, you're okay?
Okay, so my name is Jáfia, and I have recently finished my PhD at the University of Bristol and started my research fellowship at the Center for Lebanese Studies, and I work alongside Maha, so thank you so much for being here today. I am going to share some research findings from my PhD research, which focused on how young people and their families encounter England's education system. So I really wanted to highlight their perspectives of how is it like to interact with those systems, and how does policy meet lived experience. So I'm going to provide some context for the study and point out some of the obstacles that they experience, but also their aspirations and challenges that they encounter to transition to further education. So my study focused on working directly with families. Generally, research is more school-based, but I wanted to work directly with families, and I was fortunate enough to do that. I volunteered at the school. That's how I built a relationship with a school, and through the school, doing volunteer work there, I built a relationship with families who agreed to participate in the study. So it was an ethnography, and I did home visits, or we would go for walks in the park with the family, and we also did online interviews, semi-structured interviews with them whenever it was suitable for them. And I also did observations at the school and interviewed some school staff like safeguarding lead, some of the subject teachers, and mostly the EAL staff with English for additional language specialists. And we also did some arts-based activities, which you're going to see, to help young people express some of this experience that they've had in England so far. So refugees and people who have asylum-seeking status, who have an asylum claim, they are entitled to go to school in England, and they are required to go to school. So the issue is that although they have access to education, there are barriers that they face to be able to access. And these have to do with the asylum system, for example, dispersal procedures, where people may be moved around the country multiple times, or they may live somewhere where it's really far to go to school and they have to travel on public transport for a long time, or ongoing age assessments, which can take a long time depending on the case, or long waiting lists, and simply because the system can be a bit complicated to navigate for people who are not experienced with it. and sometimes agencies may not communicate well with each other to help ease the process. So one family in the study lived in 3 different cities within about 4 months. And every time they moved, they had to go to a different school, and it was difficult for them to adapt. So the families are 2 families with refugee status. So it's one family from Iraq and one family from Eritrea, and the asylum-seeking family from Mexico. And they have similar experiences, but asylum seekers seem to face even more barriers because they receive less support, they have no recourse to public funds, and they live on a weekly cash allowance of, at the time of the research, it was around 35, 36 pounds a week. And now I think it's about 45. So they feel quite isolated sometimes because they're not allowed to work, they can't open a bank account. And sometimes even to buy uniform, they may need to pay with card, but they don't have a card, they can only pay with cash. There's various little barriers that they face. And one of the main issues that came out from the data was school-home communication or lack thereof. Families felt that it was difficult sometimes to understand what were the expectations of them, or to communicate their own expectations because they care about their children's education. So sometimes they want to talk, to get involved with the school, and they sometimes find it difficult to do that. I interviewed the safeguarding lead at the secondary school where the study was conducted, and he said that the school doesn't have a strategy to welcome and support refugee background people. It's an academy status school, it's very diverse. They have quite a few refugees there, but instead they use a one-size-fits-all approach. So they focus on, we treat everyone the same, everyone is equal, that sort of approach. And then because they lack a school-wide strategy, they depend on, as he says, on the Arabic-speaking staff to build that relationship with families. The problem is that not all of the refugee families at the school speak Arabic. The Eritrean family, for example, they speak Blin. So they don't have a point of contact at the school. They can just call and ask a question or talk to them. They do have an interpreter that will mediate parent-teacher meetings. But if a parent has an urgent request, they might not be able to call and just ask a question because they feel like they might not be able to, or they don't know who to talk to. So Ms. Aya at the school is really important person because she's a EAL specialist, and she's also an immigrant, and she's an Arabic speaker. So all of the Arabic speaking families at the school contact her at all hours. Sometimes she gets calls at 11 p.m. at night, she says, from families asking for help. And here's an example of a situation of a student and father who lived in really unsuitable accommodation. And this was really impacting serious safeguarding issues for him, for the young person, but also it was impacting his education. He sometimes didn't go to school because he didn't feel well because of their living circumstances. Because she builds a relationship with families and she understands each family's circumstances, she found out about this and she was able to advocate for him with the safeguarding lead and local agencies to try to find more suitable accommodation for him. So this is a really great work that she does at the school. However, it's just mostly her who does it. So the school depends on her having that relationship and finding out this information rather than being a school-wide strategy. So I'm going to show some illustrations which are based on my research findings. So these represent the real people who participated in the research. Fatima is one of the mothers. And one important thing in my research is language, of course. Language because the families felt it was difficult for them to build relationships with British people because they don't speak English, and they are speaking English now, but when they arrived here, they struggled to connect to people, so they felt very isolated, and the only people they had friendships with were other Muslim friends, like Fatima and other Iraqi friends. A relevant point here is that she discusses how the lack of language made it difficult for her to get involved in her children's education. And she goes to college with her husband. They do ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. But it's because ESOL has been so underfunded over the years, over the last 10 years, I think the fund that they receive now is half of what it used to be. They don't get a lot of hours per week. So the progress is very slow, and they often don't feel like they're learning as much as they could. But she says that she hopes that British schools can hire people that speak both English and Arabic so that parents can understand what's going on, because she really wants to get involved, but she feels like she can't. She really cares about her children's education. And she has one son, a younger son in primary school, who has special educational needs. And at that school, she doesn't have Miss Aya, who is a point of contact, who speaks Arabic. And because she wants to know what's going on with him every day, sometimes she's just not able to because she can't find someone who interprets for her. There was also issues with language and literacy. Olivia was in year 7, and she drew this, she did this drawing of herself and reflecting on things that teachers perhaps don't know about that refugee young children might experience. So she says that when she came to the UK, she had never gone to school before in Eritrea. So it was the first time she was going to school, and her friends all spoke English, already knew their ABCs, and they were already writing and discussing complex subjects. And she was not only learning how to live in a new country, learning how to adapt to a new education system, or to the very idea of schooling, but also she didn't know her ABCs. So she felt like she wasn't smart enough, and she didn't have anyone she could share that with besides her brother, because their mom didn't go to school either, and she was still more staying at home. So she couldn't quite relate to her mom some of this challenge that she was having, and no one at school as well understood her. So she really struggled with that, feeling like she was not smart enough because she didn't know her ABCs yet. Temesgen is her brother, and one thing that he struggled was with behavior and student expectations. He didn't quite understand sometimes what was expected of him from the school, because the fractured school-home communication sometimes means that people don't know what they're expected to do. And his English teacher didn't know that he had been to school in Eritrea, however, he had never learned how to write. So he was learning how to write for the first time in England while he was learning English. And he was expected to annotate Shakespeare poems and do engineering projects. He thought engineering was supposed to be about creating something, an object, or building something. But instead it was a lot of reading and writing, and he really struggled. So his teacher, generally, this is an issue which I think it's valid to discuss, is that teachers don't have a lot of information about the students for privacy issues, the school says. So they'll know that the student is EAL. So they'll know that the student speaks another language at home, basically. But they like, for example, the teacher doesn't know if he's a refugee, or if he has been to school before or not, or if he knew how to write before or not. So he thought that he was doing quite well, that his writing was great, because for him it was so difficult. He's learning how to write at an older age, but his teacher saw it as that's not good enough, but perhaps because she lacked the context of his background. The curriculum. So Mohammed is a young man from Iraq. He's Fatima's son, and he loves history, especially the history of Iraq. And he told me that it was really boring, that history just focused on the history of Europe in school, and he learned a lot about World War I and World War II, which was fine, he said, but he really wanted to learn history about other parts of the country, of the world, and especially about Iraq, because a lot of people don't know about Iraq and what happened, the invasion of Iraq. So they are very critical, and they do have a lot of knowledge that they bring with them that they could share. So he'd love an opportunity to discuss Iraq in the classroom so he could talk to people about it. However, the curriculum, one of the teachers, the art teacher, shared that they agreed, the school agreed after the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. She said that they agreed that their curriculum was a bit Eurocentric, and they're trying to move away from that a bit. So it's still in that process. So here you see a young person who has difficulty accessing the curriculum content. The curriculum doesn't relate much to his lived experiences either. So to touch on the remote schooling during the lockdown, as Leon mentioned, poverty is a serious issue for refugee families and asylum-seeking families especially. Asylum-seeking families sometimes don't have access to free school meals because they have no recourse to public funds. And during the lockdown, they really struggled, these three families, because they didn't have the technology at home to continue their education. And there was a government program that sent computers to schools, and then schools shared with families. However, there were some delays with that, and they spent a lot of time without having access to the technology. It was also difficult for them to pay for the internet. They had unstable internet, and the asylum-seeking family had to spend a lot of money on data on their phone to be able to do the homework, because the mother went to school, to college, and she has two children who go to college, to school. So it became really expensive for them. And the schools are overwhelmed, understandably, but also they felt they were quite isolated to be able to continue doing remote schooling without guidance on how to move forward without the resources. So just to touch on Miss Aya's, the role that she plays at the school. So the schools are contested spaces, even though the school lacks this school-wide approach, strategies to support people. There are staff like Miss Aya who go beyond the call of duty to try to help students settle in school. And she's called Mama by the refugee children at the school because she's like a mother figure to them. She has helped so many families advocating for them at the school. So Olivia here wanted to share how she progressed. So she went from learning her ABCs to winning a writing competition the following year. Even though she doesn't have a lot of homework support at home, she does a lot of studying on her own using Google and YouTube, and she's an avid reader. So she's been making a lot of great progress. So young refugees, they have big dreams. They love going to school. They value their education. Some of them know they want to go to university. Maya wants to be an engineer. She drew herself with the hijab to show that you can be a woman and be an engineer and wear a hijab. Amal wants to go to medical school. Olivia wants to be a teacher. However, there is difficulty for them to know where to go after they finish school. What's next? There isn't a lot of clear guidance. Usually they are, from my observations, they were encouraged to take on apprenticeships or go to college for apprenticeships. Some of the students, like Temis Gain, didn't know, well, what do you do to go to university? What do you have to do to get there? What do you study at university? He wasn't sure. He was in year 10 and he wasn't sure about that. He had never seen a university, he said. And so he went on to go to college, and he's doing an apprenticeship now. However, he should have had at least some guidance on what opportunities are available to them, because if you don't know what opportunities are available to you, what you're able to do, you might not be able to do it just because you don't know. So I think this is an issue for a lot of these young people. The mothers as well, they also have aspirations. They want to study, they want to contribute, to participate. Maria, she's an asylum seeker. She wants to be a nurse, but as an asylum seeker, she gets very limited amount of English hours. She can study maths and English. That's it. She doesn't have access to any other education. And asylum seekers, they could be asylum seekers in this country for 10 years or more, and they're constantly living in limbo. So these illustrations are from this comic book that I created with my research participants. It's based on their stories. If you'd like to read it, you can email me and I'll share a copy with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jáfia. Now we move to G and Jess. You're doing a conversation, a dialogue.
Something like that.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Xi. I'm a PhD student here at the faculty, just finishing, God willing, and I write about the politics of higher education in Syria, but also do research on critical humanitarianisms.
Hi everyone, my name's Jess. I recently completed my doctorate at the University of East London, where I currently teach on a higher education preparation course for refugees and asylum seekers. And my research is around critical humanitarianism. Prior to academia, I spent a long time as a education and emergencies practitioner. And we're going to kind of reflect on our experiences and histories being part of that sector.
Yeah. So the paper, the working paper that we'll be discussing today is titled Between Colonial Histories and Abolitionist Futures, Education Aid and the Reimagining of Power. So Jess and I first met as two of the 6 co-founders of a collective called Seed with Maha and May, who's online. And the group organized what we called an unconference around themes of power, exploitation, and injustice in the education aid industry. That conference brought together speakers from nearly 20 countries for discussions on those themes. And our goal was really to flip the script around who exactly counts as an expert or what constitutes expertise within the field of humanitarian aid. So the paper that we're going to be talking about today is kind of an extension of a conversation that we've been having for 2 years, I guess. And as Jess said, it draws not only from our research, but also in the kind of autoethnographic spirit from our own experiences as expert aid consultants for government agencies, UN agencies, international organizations, etc. And the guiding question of the paper is whether or not a donor-led system can ever be truly just. And we want to explore that question in 3 parts. So first, Jess will speak about the longer colonial histories of humanitarianism and aid for education. And then we'll look at how those histories inform contemporary practices within the education and emergencies sector today. And we want to focus in particular on issues of funding and finance and the inequalities they generate as very much living legacies of coloniality. And then we'll end by discussing debates around both reformism and also abolitionism and talk about what a critical and kind of political response to some of these issues might look like. So before we get started, just a couple notes. The first, Maha already mentioned, we know this is a panel for Refugee Week. We're not speaking explicitly to the topic of refugees. It's both practical and political. In the first case, our work doesn't deal only with refugees. And also, as Jáfia, did I pronounce your name right? As Jáfia touched on, the politics of the concept and label of refugee is also a complicated one. It's not just about the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, but also the way that other experiences of migration, often motivated by violence, are not included or incorporated into the albeit insufficient framework of resources and legal affordances for refugees, like economic migrants as one example. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So in October 2020, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which rippled through every single sector, industry, and caused and provoked these questions or challenges around current practices and around inclusion and exclusion. The Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, which is commonly known as INEE, which is a global network open to United Nations agencies, humanitarian organizations, practitioners, academics who are working with people who have experienced crisis, whether that's through displacement or other forms of crisis. Anyway, they issued a statement, and it was a statement around, it was an anti-racism and racial equity statement, which offered a kind of admission of culpability in perpetuating a deeply racialized and hierarchical system. It was one of the first explicit statements from the education and emergency field that highlighted and used terminologies such as white supremacy culture, that reflected that some, and they say some of our structures and actions perpetuate this kind of white supremacy culture and institutional racism. And again, it was one of the few statements to date from this network that kind of highlighted that education in emergencies is marked by kind of global and local forces, both historical and present. And for me, that was really, really interesting, having worked as a practitioner within that network for many years, working for organisations where this discourse had been completely absent. In fact, you can go on the INE database site now, you can Google resources. If you put in racism, for example, there will be 1 or 2 blogs. There's a complete absence, and I think many people in this room have written about this as well. There's a complete absence or acknowledgement that these kind of power, that racism is an issue, that's something that is connected to refugee education. So anyway, this for me was a bit of a call to action to start looking into this issue more broadly, more deeply, and to start looking at the site. And I thought what was really interesting is one of the things that they have on there, which traces the history of the field of education and emergencies. And there's a timeline, and it's an interactive timeline, and it maps out the history of EIE. And so when you go on it, it says these are the key interventions, the key conventions, actors and events and publications that have shaped the field. And of course, UN agencies are all across this timeline, and kind of significant refugee education policies have been documented, but there are obviously so many absences from this timeline. There is very little mention of any refugee-led initiatives. There's a complete absence of histories of other states, for example, countries like Cuba, like Libya, who also have very long histories of supporting refugee education. You will not find it on this timeline. And I think that, again, that speaks to some of the kind of epistemic kind of silences that we see within this field, and all these hidden histories. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important to kind of excavate these hidden histories is because many of these things continue to the present. We know, or when we start looking into these things, that there is a very much a linear history between colonial projects around education and the sort of discourse we see today in the education and emergency field. There are, ample examples around how organisations today that are leading actors within the education and emergency field have these legacies within colonial projects, whether it's working in, for example, in Kenya during the 1950s, there were, during the Maha War of Independence, there were internment camps where young people were interned, and organisations such as Save the Children managed these camps, provided the education or re-education within these camps. Somebody called Emily Bourne has done a really great book. She's written a fantastic book, actually, kind of going into all of these kind of histories around how organisations, current international non-governmental organisations, have these connections within the Imperial Project. So yeah, for me, there is very much a very clear line between this, and something that needs to be highlighted more, because we can see some of those things, in fact many of those things, still echo in the present.
I think we've, in our own conversations, traced a lot of those echoes to issues around financial disparity and inequality in the contemporary aid system. And my point of reference for thinking about that is my own experience as a consultant, and my own earning history as a young person working in that field. So I worked as an expert consultant. This part is really important. On education, gender, and youth livelihoods for about 5 years prior to starting my master's and PhD. And I always found it interesting that for an industry oriented almost entirely around a perpetual crisis of funding and money, aid workers are so impossibly hesitant to talk about their own relationship to money within the field, and especially their own salaries. And my sense personally was often that it's embarrassing, especially in the field context, to talk about the kind of real economic terms of how colleagues are situated along an earning hierarchy. That hesitation makes collecting or generating data about these issues almost impossible. But I can at least share my own experience, which is that by the time I was 25, I was earning $500 a day to work on education and emergency programs based inside Syria and elsewhere in the region. And these programs were staffed by classroom teachers inside the country earning between $150 and $250 a month. And they were managed by local programmatic teams, sometimes ones I was responsible for as a 25-year-old, colleagues that were in their 40s, 50s, had been working in education for decades, who were also earning just a fraction of what I was taking home. I think it's important to point out that at 25, I only had an undergraduate degree in opera performance. I had no other professional experience. I had no direct experience as a teacher in youth mentorship or in formal education. I had very, very good intentions. And I was being hired to write these toolkits and program proposals and training materials. And I felt quite confident somehow in my expertise, which is a matter of ideological saturation I don't think we have time to talk about today. But the experience is not unique, and I think it raises a number of really important questions that deserve evidence, evidence that we're somewhat without at the moment. The extent to which the industry runs on young, self-enterprising, well-intentioned, often highly unqualified foreigners, and the way in which the high turnover of young people, often along a kind of spectrum of burnout, allows the system to perpetually reinvent itself in its own image. I think there's also this issue that, at least in my experience, earning disparities can reach easily upwards of 60%, if not more, between international and quote unquote local staff, irrespective of professional qualification or experience. And then the role that money plays in motivating people within the sector and how it shapes their priorities as professionals. And we'll get into that, a little bit later, I think.
Yeah.
Do you want to, do you want to talk about some of the kind of concrete material practices that underpin these issues of inequality?
Yeah, sure. So just building on that, this issue of the kind of pay, I guess pay inequity is a huge thing, but it's also the conditions as well and the differences. I mean, first of all, there's not many industries where you can openly advertise roles and say international staff only, but if you go onto Relief Web, which is a site for, looking for international humanitarian jobs, that's very much commonplace, like international staff only can apply for this role, or national staff only. The qualifications that may be the same, the expectations around qualifications may be the same, but one is very much titled, we want someone international for this role. There's other things as well, like tax implications. Like often, if you are in an international position, you're tax exempt in the country that you're working. So on one hand, we have organizations lamenting that governments are not investing in educational systems, but on the other hand, they're also creating or upholding a system where their own staff are not contributing to paying tax within those contexts. There's also in terms of different conditions. So often if you're in an international position, you'll have more holidays, you'll have access to maybe better health benefits, you'll be eligible for rest and recuperation because you're working in a hardship location outside of your context. So the idea is that you should receive additional benefits for this, whereas somebody who may be from the same country working in a completely different area, also far from their family, would not necessarily receive the same benefits. And we also have this whole issue around incentive work. So again, in many, many countries, based on your immigration status, you may not be eligible to work. And so within these projects, you have the teachers, the social workers, the people often doing the frontline work in extremely challenging conditions, who are not considered paid staff, who are paid as incentives, which means they receive a nominal fee. And the way this is justified is that they're doing this as part of it's because they're from the community. So it's almost like weaponizing this term community and saying, well, this, you know, you should be doing this because this is for you. This is, you know, these people are within your community, therefore you should be happy to be doing this for, you know, a very, very meager amount, whereas you would have somebody else being paid £500 a day to come in and train people on how to teach in these conditions. So I think we can see so many contradictions. Within, I guess, the mainstream kind of system.
I think the other thing we've talked about, and I think it's relevant because we're at a university, is the role of the university in this economy as well. Universities play a really important part in mechanizing the financial logics of the aid industry. So I did my master's here at Cambridge on education and international development, and partly because it was made clear to me in the industry that I needed a master's degree to progress in my career. And my classmates on my course, many of them, like me, were foreign students, international students in the UK, and also had careerist intentions. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that meant that our course was £30,000 a year. The same course at Harvard costs $120,000 over 2 years. I think we have to take stock in the fact that higher education severely indebts students who want to professionalize themselves in order to enter this field, and then often feel that they have little to no choice in prioritizing high-paying or competitive salaries as a result. And this is why, in a sense, sometimes I think we find young people who see the financial logics of the aid industry as somewhat commonsensical, because they've made an $120,000 investment in their career to do education in emergencies, to save education in these far-flung places sometimes. So it's not just an issue of professionalization, it's also an issue of how young people are interpolated, or how young people are made into certain kinds of financial or capitalist subjects. And it allows for young people to imagine this idea of saving lives, or sometimes saving the world, as something that's not only ethical, but also lucrative. It is an industry, whether people think of it on those terms or not. And I think there's a lot to say there about the imaginary that accompanies that idea of personal profit, and what it means about this kind of moralized notion of the good life. And then the last thing I would say about universities is also our relationship to the knowledge economy. Many of us in this room, and this isn't, it just is, we have to find funding, and often we find research funding to work with these large international organizations. And in doing so, we have no choice but to participate in the kind of financial structures of how research is paid for. It involves, on the kind of discursive management end, a certain idea of expertise. So we at Cambridge are the experts, and it prioritizes our kind of tools and technologies for research over community knowledges about those same issues. But the budgets themselves are often also baffling, and it's hard to point out because many of us in these institutions in a country like the UK are struggling for fair wages ourselves. So there are very tricky comparative political questions, but nonetheless, it must be said that we often are the laborers of a system that we also are disenchanted and disillusioned by.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up, how much time do we have now? 2 minutes? Okay, so I think just to wrap up, we wanted to talk about reformism and abolitionism. Maybe just, I was just going to talk about the superficiality of the localization debate, which we can come back to in the questions, but do you want to talk about abolitionism?
Yeah, maybe just to lead on this point around education and universities, whilst of course they are complicit in the system, they can also be sites of resistance and struggle. And I think there's some, really interesting work happening around debordering educational spaces. The fact that many people who are living in kind of carceral geographies or refugee camps are accessing higher education programs. They're doing that in spite of very hostile bordering practices. They're doing that in spite of maybe mainstream INGOs who focus on this idea of basic education, which again is a leftover from kind of colonial, kind of a colonial legacy, and who are reaching out and searching for these opportunities to continue their higher education, learning. And I think that is an example of not reforming the system, but doing something that is maybe perhaps like a non-reformist reform that is supporting people to access something that has been so far for them for so long.
Someone please ask Jess a question about abolitionism, because she has a lot of really important things to say. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. May, over to you. I think Jáfia will probably have to, to ask you for this responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I share my screen, or do you, Jáfia, do you have my...
I think it might be better, Yusuf, if you come here, because the camera is directed toward here.
Sitting this here.
It's all right. We can bring another chair. I can move this way.
All right. I think this is a difficult role. I'm not going to try to pretend to do justice to what I think is a very rich and textured discussion. I'm just going to try to, in the time I've got, to talk about what I heard, but also what I did not hear enough about in the 4 sets of presentations. But just as a way of thinking through it, we began with an understanding of a theory and a framework to how we might begin to imagine the provision of inclusiveness and quality education for refugees, to moving on to discussion of voice, and particularly giving voice to those who are most marginalized. And then we began to segue into asking questions about voice. Whose voice should be heard? And what about the voice of those working in the field? And what about the investments of privilege of those who are in the field themselves? Moving to a discussion of very powerfully about the structures in which voice takes place and the inequalities that are structural and the experiences which are structured and structuring. And I think that's important to recognize that. So I'm going to make about a few points. The first point is that what comes across all 4 presentations is the politics of naming and the politics of how you problematize the field. How do you set the problem? And here there's a question that all the presenters raised about naming. Is it refugee? Is it not refugee? Is it asylum? Is it differently asylum? Is it neither of those? And are there other terms? Are these terms essentialized or not essentialized? And it's the politics of naming, because in names matter and how you name matter. But it's also about who gets to do the naming and who gets to define the problem. If it's an international agency naming the problem, is it the government, is it the actors, or is it the targets or the marginalized themselves? And in that sense, the other politics of the problem in the field is about how the field constitutes an idea of what the issues are, either in the form of a moral panic, or either in the form of containment, because if we don't deal with refugees in one way or another, we have a problem on our hands. And if we don't, and if we ensure that they rather stay in Turkey rather than come to UK as refugees, then our problems of violence and security are so much better. It's a different way of naming. But what I didn't hear about the discursive constitution of refugees from all the presenters was there's quite an elision between North and South, but there's also differentiations of how refugees get treated within the South. The experiences of refugees, or however named, in Turkey are very different from the very same Syrian refugees in UK, or if they find themselves in Jordan or other ways. So it's not just a North and South problems, it's also within South problems. And in South Africa, the xenophobia against the other is equally significant from a government that has one of the most progressive constitutions, in fact. So in that sense, we also got to understand who's doing the work and who's doing the damage as well. It's about international agencies, but it's also about national governments that themselves emerge in the context of histories of legacies of oppression and violence. The ethno-nationalism that Leon talks about is done by very governments themselves who appropriate languages of colonial struggle in ways that we can talk about the curriculums of India that being reconstituted in history right now and how the political figures get named. So I think that's quite significant. And in that sense, the discursive constitutions of refugees is about how the problems, how the solutions, but also what I didn't hear enough was the experience of refugees or othering is protracted. It's not a short-term problem. If anything, the data tells us that if you're a refugee or a migrant, whichever word you use, you're never going to go back. And in fact, I think the last speaker pointed out that the experience is long-term. UNRWA is more than 60 years old. You know, it started in the 70s, way back. So we're talking of organizations that are 70 years old, that begin to become states in themselves, and that begin to model elements of the state. So in that sense, the experience of displacement, violence, and othering is a long-term process. So I guess the solutions also has to be thought of in that kind of way. And in all of this, the questions we have to ask is about, you know, beyond the voluntary and forced, beyond economic migrants, other forms of violence, is the experience spatial and or temporal and or permanent? Because the issue of protectiveness raised the question, is the spatial location as a refugee, is it a temporary one or is it a permanent one? Because that leaves what was relatively spoken about slightly less, is that the frontline workers who work with the refugees, right? Or the others, right? And here, I didn't hear a lot about the teachers themselves, right? Other than incentive teachers, who are the teachers who interface with them? How does Leon, your framework, accommodate teachers? You know, how do the teachers themselves deal with their identities? Because refugees teachers themselves are also come from the very context they're part of. The work we did in Rwanda points out very powerfully that the teachers were not just victims, they were perpetrators of violence and genocide. So the teachers have this dual-natured relationship, and how they deal with the other is also an issue. And therefore the teachers who deal with the refugees, as some of the presenters showed, range from teachers who deny the existence of the other or the identities of the refugees to teachers who affirmed it in ways that stereotype the other. So in a sense, as a teacher, how do you navigate that? And how do you deal with the street level bureaucrats, actors? In other words, we talk about agencies, but we don't talk about the frontline street level bureaucrats who makes the decision. There's a lot of study about how custom officers make decisions when you arrive at the airport or when you're a migrant coming from Mexico or in whichever way into the US, because if you've ever been to Heathrow, the street level border security guard is the person who's making that first call within policy, but ultimately has the agential space to reinterpret it. Names matter to them. They pick up your name and they'll stop you. They develop proxy codes for how they deal with it. And I don't get a sense that we're talking about that in particular. I get a sense that also the other part of it is the experience of being marginalized, whereas as a refugee and asylums, is one economists talk about shocks, right? They're more vulnerable to shocks, right? And another way of understanding it is that COVID-19, as some people spoken about, exacerbated fragilities that were already existent. So I think part of the analysis has to see how crises are structural, but also interlocking, and how crises also exacerbate inequalities and fragilities that are experienced. I guess there's a big question to be asked in this field about the field itself. Who's the gaze? I think what I didn't hear in that discussion enough of was a discussion around the class of citizens who are not only just appointed internationally, but the class of citizens in this world who are actually international and designated as such. If you work for the World Bank or UNESCO, you stand outside a national boundary. You carry an international passport. Not only do you avoid tax, you avoid the kinds of liabilities that you have. So there's very little research in the field of development around this genre and this group of citizens who are outside the state boundaries, right? Who are technically, there's an international civil service association, a union for international civil servants, whose boundaries allow them to, and whose status is different. So I guess even within the field of international development, the point I'm trying to make is that how do you deal with that? And how do you accommodate the different levels and differentiations within and between international organizations, actors and agencies? ActionAid has histories, but so does World Bank, and World Bank has differential histories as well. And I guess the question it raises, and I'm not sure I have an answer, expertise is always a form of inequality, right? Under what conditions is certain forms of expertise more legitimate than others? Is the form of expertise that you see in the Cuban context, right? It's a very progressive expertise, where the doctor's expertise is no different from the teacher's expertise. Is that the kind of expertise we're talking about? But that requires a particular social, economic, and political order, right? Whereas the expertise you see in universities is not within it's crucially within the field of international development, but it also generically across all fields, how knowledge constitute powerful expertise, which then generates systems of inequality because of the structural conditions in which that knowledge is transacted. And so how do you deal with that? And how do we find ways around it? That's why I'd like to hear where you go with the abolitionists or the reparations argument, because that will be quite important for helping think through how one might think of more egalitarian. Lastly, I guess there are two other things that I want to say. One is the idea, because there is also the argument of red expertise under the Chinese Maoist period and going on beyond that, and under Cuba, and that was also seen in South Africa when, and still today in South Africa, the expertise of Cuba is significant for propping up a failing health system, right? For dealing with a failing health system, and the doctors come from Cuba. They don't come from elsewhere, because as South African doctors leave, you have to have alternative doctors. So there is that kind of solidaristic thinking that might offer a possibility of how expertise, which in itself, epistemic understanding can be unequal, right? But how it can also at the same time have, if it's exercised in a solidaristic way, can begin to overcome some of the inequities without, through the sacrifice, through, if you like, the redistribution of positional authority, yet recognizing the episteme as a source of differentiation, I guess, is the point. I think lastly, the forms of violence that was raised by the last presentation are important. It's the violence, and we spoke a little about that. You know, it's about the epistemic violences, and that form of epistemic violences in the field is in the form of the silences of the curriculum. And the curriculum is an important one, because I didn't hear enough of it, but I think you raised it. What is the curriculum that, on the one hand, affirms identity? Is it a curriculum, as the Syrian refugees and UNICEF tried to struggle through, not very successfully, is it a curriculum for recognizing where you'll end up? Or is it a curriculum that seeks return? Or is it a curriculum that seeks integration in the temporal? How do you navigate, and how do you provide for all those things simultaneous in curricular terms? Because it's a hard question, right? How do you deal with it? You want to affirm identity, you want to recognize background, but you want to recognize people are here and are destined elsewhere or seek to move elsewhere. How do you negotiate? Greek NGOs struggle with this a lot, right? And we should talk about Greece, because that's the most recent tragedy that's right on our door. But Greek NGOs struggle with that, right? How do they talk about, do they make Greek mandatory for every refugees coming in a temporal context? Or do they see it as a need for accessing social services whilst temporal in Greece and transiting elsewhere? How do you deal with that? I don't think I have an answer, but I think it's important. So that form of violence is important because bodily and physical violence is often accompanied by the violence of episteme and the epistemic violence. The two have to go hand in hand in most conditions of marginality. And so for me, it was those kinds of things that struck me when I heard the presentations, which I thought were very rich in texture. So thank you, and I hope I've done justice to what is a very rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. And thank you for all presenters. A lot to reflect on and to discuss. I personally have many questions, but I won't abuse my power, and we'll take the first round of questions from audience in the room, but also online. Please feel free to send your questions. So let me check if I have any questions so far. Yes. Okay, 1 minute. Let me just. Okay, so I think the first question is for Leon. From Maha, how do you respond to hosting governments when they use the pretext of national sovereignty to avoid or justify the absence of providing more inclusive, contextual, and relevant curricula for refugees? So that's the first question. The second question for May, so I'm going to share 3 questions and then we take the first round and then we answer them. May, a question for May. Would you agree that the concept of solidarity is as powerful, if not more, encompassing than care in attempting to make a breakthrough and finding solutions beyond impasses? And a question for Jess and G, please elaborate on abolitionism. Yes, all right. I think there's a message for you, which I'll pass it on later. All right, thank you. Over to you.
Okay, could you just repeat the question for me? So I didn't quite catch it.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you respond to hosting governments when they use the pretext of national sovereignty to avoid or justify the absence of providing more inclusive, contextual, and relevant curricula for refugees? This, I guess, applies to England, but also like to countries like Lebanon, where we learn the curriculum in English or French, and we use it. Any attempt to use Arabic is it's a violation of national sovereignty.
Yeah.
That's just one example.
Yeah. So it's part of wider struggles to decolonize the curriculum, or to critique very narrow ethno-nationalist kind of approach to the curriculum that you see in places like England, unfortunately, at the moment. And of course, you know, I think this argument is not only important for refugees and minoritized and racialized groups. It's fundamental for in England for our white working class, you know, for all groups, that they have an understanding, a critical understanding of their global citizenship. And that can only come about through appreciating that history isn't as it's been written as they've experienced it in many English textbooks, as being somehow devoid of colonialism, where colonialism didn't happen, where racism hasn't been a fact, where patriarchy hasn't happened, where class struggle hasn't happened, the suppression of our own classes in this country. So I see it very much as part of these wider struggles to decolonize the curriculum, and not just to decolonize, but to infuse our curriculum with concerns around class and gender, and make these struggles visible to people.
I have a question to Prof on that later on, related also to decolonizing PGCSEs. You know, even like requirement for being a student for PGCSEs. Basically, you have to be mainly of a specific background, and there's very limited flexibility on who can even be considered an eligible for a PGCSE course, which this is why probably we end up with the kind of teaching task force that we end up also. Jess and she, if you'd like, and then May.
Thank you for our discussants' comments. I think we share a lot of those concerns, and one of the ways in which we think about those concerns is through localization and our kind of political response or ethic to it. So localization, or the idea that the humanitarian system can be devolved downwards so that local communities have more decision-making power and ownership over aid, in principle, is an important thing. It's often critiqued as cosmetic or superficial in that not enough power or not enough actual power is given to those closer to the ground. My problem with it is more about thinking through this issue of the relationship between the global south and the global north, which is actually that oftentimes plugging in these very large institutionalized, quote unquote, local or national NGOs is mostly an elite to elite power transfer. They co-produce, reproduce, produce on their own the same kinds of exploitation and injustice, in part because they are enmeshed within local structures of power and of how power has been sort of sustained in an imbalanced way given the country context. So I think for us, that's why any framework that takes the nation state as the basis for political or more liberatory or emancipatory questions about aid will always be a reinscription, much like May was talking about. If we take the nation state as the guide, then we're stuck to its limits and conceptions. And I think the last thing I'll say before I give it to Jess is, I agree in some ways that it's helpful to think about aid organizations as states of their own, in that they are replacing sometimes important social services, but it is really important to remember that often they are supra-sovereign organizations, and there is no practical possible route to an egalitarian or collectivized kind of participation that is substantively political, because there's no actual relationship, legal relationship between the subjects of the aid organization state and its centers of power. And that's another reason for me why a political response to the aid system cannot kind of exist within the structures of the existing aid system itself.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think it's also important to note that when we think about abolition, that it actually, when it's grounded in how I understand it coming from the Black radical tradition, it is an affirmative politics. We're not saying we need to get rid of all education and emergency aid right now because it's inherently unjust and replicates, unjust systems and leave a complete void. But I think what is very important to note that the current system does exclude, it does reinforce social hierarchies, and it does perpetuate a banking system of education. And when we talk about exclusion, it is always the people who've got the greatest proximity to the issue, who are furthest away from decision making in this field, in this arena. I think it's also like my understanding of abolitionism and why it's so important in this field is about radically reimagining what education could look like in these contexts and who's involved. And we see so many examples of that already happening. I think, like, again, May's presentation, these examples of community-led education actors, services, those services exist everywhere. We also see other forms of mutual aid, which are providing people with opportunities to continue learning, but also to define learning on their terms. So for me, I think it is a positive kind of political approach, and something that is currently happening, but is often undocumented, unrecognized, and erased from kind of mainstream narratives.
Thanks, Jess. So are you calling for abolishing INE and all of that? That's what one comment I got on a paper, like, so should we abolish INE?
I think I think with the discourse around abolitionism, I think it's difficult for one person to decide on that. I think, you know, for many people, it is a system that works for them. It's a system that people want to be a part of. It's not for, myself to say, but I wholly agree that it is an equitable system. It is a system that excludes many people, and I think there are better ways of doing this. And we can see that. We can see many organisations, many people, many individuals, many teachers themselves coming up with different ways of working, which I think we should be looking to, as opposed to consistently reinforcing a system that isn't rooted in grassroots.
To be on the spot,
No,
over to you.
Thank you, Maha. Just one comment on the abolishing INE. INE is a product of an industry, and I think the problem is within the industry, not the network itself. So it's like a kind of a reflection. It's a symptom, not the root cause of the problem. So maybe should we abolish the INE is the wrong question. The question is, what do we do with the industry itself that's kind of perpetuating all these injustices, maybe. In terms of the question, the difference between solidarity and care are completely different concepts and ideas. So from my perspective in talking about Palestine, when Jamil and I were highlighting the idea of care, it's care within the Palestinian society or communities, the fragmented and exiled, and those. So even if you're a Palestinian in Australia or Chile or Argentina or Jordan or the West Bank, being a Palestinian, you are part of the struggle for return and liberation. So if you decide to, for example, to engage in a process of mutual aid or go on a demonstration in Argentina, you're not standing in solidarity with the Palestinians, you are part of the struggle for Palestine. While solidarity, if you're not a Palestinian and on the justice side of the world and want to fight for justice in this world and for liberation and return, then you're standing in solidarity with the Palestinians. So it's a different concept and it applies to different people, I think.
Thank you, May. We'll take questions in the room.
So thank you for the presentations and thank you for your reflections. That were terrific. I was reflecting on the first moment when I encountered the Education in Emergencies program, and it was Chris Colclough who was running it at the time, and it was a meeting, I think probably Leon, you might have been there. Mario at Novelli had organised it, and it was a very difficult set of days because the agenda that I think Mario had kind of put together and explicitly was about the time that the war in Iraq was taking place. And there was an extremely high level of defensiveness, if not explicit aggressiveness on the part of Chris Colclough. And yet there were students, for example, I think at Amsterdam, that were to begin to engage with interrogating bits of the Education in Emergencies agenda and so on. And that made me kind of think of the question of what one's to abolish. And I think abolitionism is to abolish what? So the defence of the indefensible, in this case, Chris Colclough, who wouldn't have a word that was actually said about the intervention at all. It was off the agenda and so on. And the other thought that I had when you were speaking that links to this is I was involved actually in supporting the writing of the UN Rapporteur's report on immigration, migration, asylum seeking, and so on. And what was so interesting, despite, for example, the shamefulness and the recognised shamefulness of Australia's policy of incarceration of asylum seekers, refugees, on an island beyond and outside of Australia, is that there was no way that one could name member states of the UN for their practices in relation to refugees, asylum seekers, immigration policy, and so on. So there was a kind of stitch up. So I mean, so my question, I think, is targeting our abolition strategies rather than just abolition per se. And again, I'm thinking of PhD student Jonathan Birtwell, more recently, that I supervised, whose PhD was actually on a whole range of different refugees who ended up asylum in Malaysia. But for them, the credential was really important. And the IB credential was particularly important because these were their passports out. So these were spaces that were productive. So I think it's Leon's comment about where are the productive, so how do we abolish and make more visible the practices of silencing and policing and refusal to name and so on? And how do we elevate those little mini spaces of empowerment that actually can make a difference to the possibility for moving beyond simply just waiting and waiting and waiting, and so on, a movement beyond. Now they're little, my understanding is that they're tiny little things, but that might be a kind of pragmatic, concrete kind of way forward. So that was just my thoughts.
I know we're coming to our time. We're coming, unfortunately, to our time, but interestingly, on the advert in Arabic, it said 10 to 12:30. So I thought, okay, interesting timing difference, but we'll try to wrap up in 5 minutes. I just wanted to follow up on Susan's comment, but also some comments, I mean, you've already alluded to this, but also Yusuf. If we want to talk about abolitionism and like, where do we situate our scholarship? But also I feel like who's engaging in this scholarship or in this thinking? I mean, most of what is done by these, what you call them, international citizens. And I often actually ask, we're having a discussion in the center because we're coming face to face with these institutions and we're clashing. Like, how do you also hold them accountable? How do you stand against this industry that, particularly, like, take for example DFID now that is part of the Foreign Office, and we spoke about this before. So it has become, aid has become part of the diplomacy, which means it's going to become more part of the government settlements, and negotiation, what curriculum. I mean, in the case of Lebanon, even UNHCR says it bluntly, we should integrate refugees in the curriculum of the host country, without discussing the politics of doing this, or without discussing membership of these individuals in this new host state. So I think there's, there are two questions I don't know if we can engage with, but the kind of knowledge production that we're doing, the kind of research and how we're engaging with them, the counter argument that we're giving in the face of this industry and the machine that it's producing. And I think it's one of the main machines that has been pushing this discourse. And another point we did not talk enough about it, is the apolitical nature of this whole field, that we're working this and we're being pushed more and more to be apolitical. And maybe we need a workshop on labels. What are we talking about? Is it refugee, migrants? I mean, I was wondering, actually, is there a difference between migrants and refugees, or not? So with the statistics, because you said non-immigrants. So I was thinking, are there differences between immigrants and refugees in England in terms of their attainment? I mean, do we know that or we don't? I know lots of comments, but shall we have like concluding remarks from each of the speakers, like a 1 minute? Is that okay?
Okay, no, I think that's really interesting. So I think, it is a battle on many fronts, and I think the small things do matter. I think systems change through incremental change, and they reach a tipping point in a crisis, and we have to work towards that. And we're dealing with interlocking systems. Whether we're talking about education systems in specific countries or the international aid system. And I think there's a critical role for research, But what I would like to say, and I don't think has really been mentioned so far, I should also take this opportunity to thank Yusuf for those very useful remarks. I'd like to talk to you particularly around the role of teachers, which I think is particularly important in the context of my presentation. But just to say, I do think there's a really important role for research in this area. What I think is important, though, is that research is co-created. I think that we need to think about how we can democratize the research that we do as critical scholars, that we do research not on refugees, but with refugee communities and with policymakers from low-income countries that are and that are caught up in these international systems and international organizations. So it's very important that we co-create the research with groups and individuals who are on the periphery and at the receiving end of these unequal power relationships we've been talking about.
I guess two things to end on. The first is our colleague Basma Hajir is in the online room, I think, and I just want to repeat something that she taught me and brought to our seed space, which is to Susan's point about being direction oriented and in a way goal oriented as a pragmatics of politics. Basma talks about decolonization as finding the cracks and just trying to widen them in whatever way you can as a kind of decolonial commitment. And I find that so helpful to keep in mind when these discussions and challenges feel larger than life. And then the other thing I'll say is I agree so much with the idea of the co-production of knowledge, and Jess is an expert in participatory research approaches. The challenge there is also working against the kind of editorial and disseminatory politics of knowledge production in the aid industry, because it is very effective in depoliticizing information. And my colleague Zaina Al-Azma and I are writing a paper about this now, about her framework, The Right to Meaning. Who has the right to meaning in discourses on aid? And the only people that have a claim to political meaning in aid discourse are donors. So what are the politics of platforming voices that we're also going to have to often dehumanize, depoliticize, desensitize? So I'll leave it there.
So just thinking a little bit about the context in England and also on decolonization. The British curriculum it tends to be very apolitical and to not engage with the history of Britain's colonial history. So I think that even to discuss issues of migration in schools are challenging, because teachers, or not all teachers of course, but some teachers or students are not learning this history. They don't learn why do we have refugees coming to England, and where do they come from, what created them. So I think that it would be helpful if people could have these conversations more. We know that these are not accidental decisions not to include this history in the curriculum. It's a political decision itself. So I think that in schools, the schools I've visited, there is generally a lack of understanding of the background as to why people are coming here, or a view that a lot of people are coming here, or there's a very serious crisis, and we know that most refugees never make it to Europe. They stay in the global south. So I think first it would be helpful to acknowledge this history within the UK, and UK's role in the world, its history, and which is ongoing process of colonization that still take place. So yeah.
Excuse me. Also, if I may just very quickly add to that, I think in terms of Britain's internal colonialism as well. If we're talking to our white working class, they've been refugees in the past. The Highland clearances in Scotland, the potato famine in Ireland. you know, if one looks at class as an issue as well, then I think that's also important.
May, before we wrap up, any final comments?
Is Jess gonna say anything?
Jess, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just didn't want to jump the queue.
No, please go ahead, and then I'll come in.
Okay. No, I just want to build on what G was saying based on Basma's work in terms of the cracks. I think the pockets of resistance and widening the pockets of resistance is key for us. However, the pushback that we need to focus on, not only on the institutions that are traditionally commit the violations, like governments, for example, or institutions like universities, that colonial universities we work in, but also the scholars that are jumping on the decolonial discourse and watering it down. So the battle is not only against the very clear institutional violations, but also now we are facing a wave of watering down what we're trying to do. Like in one of my slides, I was talking about, I didn't mention that, but how the Israeli authorities push the Palestinians out and create parks as part of greenwashing the crimes that they're committing. It's exactly the same. Jumping on decolonization, watering it down, actually is very dangerous, and this is being done regularly. And this is a way of a pushback that we need to consider really seriously. Otherwise, we're losing the battle, basically, because this kind of whitewashing of the violations that are happening and using diversity and inclusion as a way to show actually the problems there are no problems anymore. And what Leon was talking about, being colorblind in the education system, these are very dangerous issues that we need to be very careful of.
Thank you, May.
Yeah, just picking up on May's point around the kind of washing of this term decolonization or decolonizing practices and research methods. I think we also have to be careful or cautious with this term abolition as well. And that's, for me, my understanding of it. And we see this growing in kind of critical humanitarian inquiry. We see references to the humanitarian industrial complex. But I think unless we're really grounding that practice within a kind of deeper understanding of what that term means, where it comes from, we need to be really careful that we don't remove any commitment to scholar activism. And I think that's really, really critical. And there, that is one of the cracks. And I think that's one of the things, those of us who are working within universities or who may be working within these organizations, there are those small possibilities to turning them into sites of struggle and extending or using the privileges that we have within these places to start to redistribute, even if it's just incremental things, to try and chip away at a system that we see as being inherently unjust.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry we took longer than we had expected. Thank you for very stimulating discussion and lots of ideas. And I'm glad that we have the lunch to continue this conversation. Thank you. And and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Bye.
Bye, May.
Bye, Jess. Bye, Jáfia. Bye, Leon.
May, come visit soon.
Will do.
Thank you for organising.
Yes, thank you for Jáfia also for helping with the organizing, and Maisa and Oddy. Thanks.